When the doctor told me I was dying, I thought the hardest part would be facing death. I was wrong. The real heartbreak came the night I tried to confess my illness to my wife, only to learn she'd been hiding a secret of her own, one that would change the rest of my short life forever. When I first started coughing up traces of blood, I convinced myself it was just the dry air in the office or maybe the long hours I had been putting in lately. I had always been one of those men who prided himself on powering through discomfort without a fuss, so I ignored it for as long as I could. It wasn't until one morning when I woke up feeling as if there were weights pressing on my chest that I finally went to the doctor. They ran a few tests and told me not to worry until the results came back, but even then I could tell from the way the nurse avoided meeting my eyes that something wasn't right. The call came 3 days later while I was at work. My doctor's voice was calm and steady, but I could hear the weight behind every word as he explained that the scans showed signs of stage 4 lung cancer. I sat there at my desk staring at the reflection of my computer screen, trying to make sense of what he had just said. Stage 4 meant there was no fixing it, no turning things around, no miracle cure waiting in some corner of hope. It meant that my life, which I had always assumed stretched out in front of me for decades, was now shrinking fast. For a while I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents, not my friends, and not my wife. Especially not her. I told myself it was because I wanted confirmation from more tests, but deep down I knew the real reason. I was scared of what her face would look like when she heard it. She had always been the stronger one between us, the one who could handle a crisis with steady hands and level eyes while I unraveled quietly in the background. But lately things between us had felt strained in ways I couldn't quite define. She worked longer hours than usual and seemed distracted even when we were together. Sometimes I would ask how her day had been and she'd answer without really hearing her own words. I tried to convince myself it was just work stress. Everyone goes through patches like that, I thought. So I kept my secret to myself for a few more days, rehearsing how I might tell her. Maybe I'd do it over dinner in that calm kitchen light we both loved when the world felt softer and slower. Maybe I'd tell her on a walk at dusk when the air felt gentle and forgiving. Every time I tried to find the right moment, it slipped away from me. The night I finally decided to tell her, it rained. The kind of steady rain that hums against the windows and makes the whole world feel smaller. She came home later than usual, her hair damp and her eyes red like she'd been crying, though she brushed it off when I asked. I told her we needed to talk and she froze. There was a moment where she looked at me almost like she was bracing for impact. I took a deep breath, ready to say it, ready to tell her that my time was running out, but before I could speak she broke down crying. At first I thought she had somehow sensed it, that maybe she already knew something terrible was happening to me. But then she said something that made my stomach twist in confusion. She said she knew what I was about to say. I stood there completely lost as she confessed that she had been seeing someone else from her office and that she was pregnant with his child. The words didn't make sense at first. I remember looking at her hands as she wrung them together the way she always did when she was nervous, and thinking that she must be mistaken, or maybe this was some kind of cruel joke. But then she kept talking, explaining through sobs that it had started months ago during a work trip, that they had both been drinking, that one night turned into several, that she hadn't meant for it to happen. I sat there listening to her voice without really hearing it anymore. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone in the world was now a stranger sitting across from me in our living room. My chest ached, not from the illness but from something deeper, something heavier. I had walked into that moment ready to tell her I was dying, and instead she told me our marriage already was. After she finished talking there was silence. The kind of silence that swallows everything. She waited for me to say something, but I had nothing left to give. My mind felt hollow, my heart numb. She whispered that she was sorry, but the words sounded empty, like air slipping through a cracked door. I didn't tell her about the cancer. Couldn't. Not after hearing that. The thought of letting her look at me with pity after all this felt unbearable. So I just told her we were done. No shouting, no questions, no anger. Just a quiet finality that seemed to echo through the walls. She nodded, almost like she had expected it, and said she would move out soon. I watched her leave the room without turning back, and when the door clicked shut behind her I felt something inside me collapse. That night I sat in the dark thinking about how strange it was that two completely separate tragedies had collided in the same hour. My body was falling apart from the inside out, and now so was the life I had built. I had lost both futures at once, the one I had planned with her and the one I thought I still had time to live. When I finally fell asleep that night, I dreamed of standing in the middle of a road with two paths ahead of me, one fading into light and the other into darkness, and I couldn't tell which one I was supposed to take. The morning after her confession, I woke up in a fog of disbelief so thick that for a brief second I thought I had dreamed it. Then I saw the half-packed boxes near the closet and her empty side of the bed, and the truth hit me all over again. My wife was gone in more ways than one. The house felt like a stranger's space, now stripped of its warmth and rhythm. Even the faint smell of her perfume clung to the air like a ghost that refused to leave. I went through the motions of the day without really feeling present. I brewed coffee but didn't drink it. I stared at the walls for hours trying to process everything that had happened in that single night. I had walked into it ready to share the most terrifying secret of my life, and instead had been handed a new one that hurt even more. The absurdity of it made me laugh at one point, a dry, humorless laugh that startled even me. If life had a sense of irony, it was in full display here. As the day dragged on, I caught myself checking my phone every few minutes, half expecting a message from her, maybe something apologetic or desperate, but nothing came. By evening, I learned that silence can be its own kind of cruelty. She was staying in the guest room for the time being, since moving out would take a few days. I heard her moving around down the hall that night, carefully quiet, like someone afraid to disturb a sleeping animal. We didn't speak. The walls carried every unspoken word between us. In the days that followed, I began to notice how time behaves differently when you're waiting for something to end. Each hour stretched wider than the last. I found myself lying awake long after midnight, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and thinking about how easily a life can unravel. I thought about all the times she had said she loved me, all the small moments that now felt staged by hindsight. It wasn't anger that consumed me, but a kind of cold emptiness. I decided that she didn't deserve to know about my illness. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I couldn't bear the thought of her pity. The woman who had betrayed me didn't get to hold my hand while pretending to care. I would carry this secret myself and meet the end on my own terms. Still, there were practical things to consider. My job, my savings, my family. I spent the next week sorting through paperwork like a man cleaning up after a storm. There was a strange peace in doing small, ordinary things. I folded laundry. I washed the dishes. I made lists of things that needed to be done. It gave me a sense of control in a situation where everything else was slipping away. Sometimes I'd catch sight of her wedding photo still sitting on the shelf near the living room, and I'd wonder when exactly the version of her I loved had disappeared. Maybe she had been fading for a long time and I just refused to see it. I began noticing changes in my body more often now. The fatigue was heavier, the coughing more persistent. The doctors had given me medications to manage the symptoms, but they couldn't slow the inevitable. I didn't tell my colleagues anything about my diagnosis. I started working from home, claiming stress and health issues vague enough to avoid questions. In truth, I just didn't want anyone looking at me with that quiet sympathy people reserve for the dying. Late one night, I wandered into the guest room while she was asleep. The light from the hallway spilled across the boxes she had been filling with clothes and books. On the nightstand sat a framed photo of us from our honeymoon. We looked so young, so certain that we would always have each other. I wanted to hate her for ruining that memory, but instead I just felt tired. There is a limit to how much heartbreak one body can carry, and I had reached mine. The next morning she told me she had found a new apartment and would be moving out within a few days. She spoke carefully, avoiding my eyes. I nodded without saying much. She mentioned she would leave most of the furniture since it had been bought together. I thanked her, which felt ridiculous, but politeness was the only armor I had left. When she finally rolled her last suitcase down the driveway, I stood at the window watching until she turned the corner and vanished. The silence that followed was almost comforting. No footsteps, no small talk, no reminders of betrayal. Just the sound of the clock ticking steadily, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. I spent that evening sitting on the porch watching the light fade. The air was cool, and for the first time in weeks I could breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in. Later that night, I opened my laptop and began searching for her lover online. It wasn't curiosity so much as a strange compulsion to put a face to the man who had upended my life. It didn't take long to find him. A smiling photo on a company website, his hand resting on the shoulder of a woman who was unmistakably his wife. She looked kind, the kind of person who trusts easily. I felt an ache for her that surprised me. She had no idea that her husband was about to shatter her world too. I clicked through their social media pages, one after another, reading captions about love anniversaries, weekend trips. They looked happy and ordinary. The irony was bitter. I could almost imagine my wife taking those same photos with him, laughing the same way she once laughed with me. My chest tightened again, but not just from the illness. It was grief layered over exhaustion and something close to pity. As I sat there in the dim light, I thought about whether to tell his wife. Part of me wanted to protect her from learning the truth too late the way I had. Another part wondered if it was even my place to interfere. Maybe she was better off not knowing. Maybe ignorance could spare her the kind of pain that now lived in my bones. I shut the laptop and sat back, staring into the darkness. Somewhere in another room, the clock ticked on, marking the hours I had left. I told myself I'd decide tomorrow, but deep down I already knew that this secret, like all the others, would not stay buried for long. The days after she moved out stretched thin like paper, too fragile to hold their own weight. Mornings blurred into evenings without much distinction. I still made coffee every day, though I never finished it. There was something oddly comforting about the ritual of pouring it into the same chipped mug she once teased me for keeping. The house was quieter than it had ever been, yet somehow the silence seemed to hum with her absence. I'd walk through the rooms and feel as though she had only just left a few minutes ago, as if I might catch a trace of her voice if I listened hard enough. I started keeping a notebook by my bed to jot down thoughts before they vanished. Some pages were filled with practical matters, appointments, bills, instructions for my parents after I was gone, but most of it turned into scattered reflections on life and endings. Writing helped me untangle the knots in my mind. I wrote about how betrayal doesn't explode all at once, but rather seeps slowly into everything until even breathing feels different. I wrote about how strange it felt to mourn two things at once: my health and my marriage. Sometimes the words came out sharp, other times they were soft, almost forgiving. I kept telling myself that dying should have made everything simpler. When your time is limited, you imagine clarity will come easily, that the things which truly matter will rise to the surface. But the truth is that dying only magnifies confusion. It makes every emotion heavier and every silence louder. I found myself alternating between bitterness and calm resignation, sometimes within the same hour. One evening, while sorting through some old boxes, I came across a folder filled with travel brochures from places we had once talked about visiting. There were maps of Greece, photos of mountain cabins in Colorado, and a printout of a beach house we almost rented for an anniversary trip that never happened. I held those papers in my hands for a long time, wondering how we had gone from planning a lifetime of adventures to ending like this. I wondered if she ever looked at these things now, or if they had become just another part of the past she was eager to forget. That night, my coughing was worse than usual. I sat on the edge of the bed, catching my breath and staring at the dim outline of the curtains. The air felt thick, heavy with everything unsaid. I tried to picture her face, not as it looked the night she confessed, but the way it used to look when she was lost in thought. I remembered the small scar on her chin from when she fell off her bike as a kid, the way she used to hum under her breath when she cooked. Those memories should have hurt, but instead they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's story. A week later, I met with my doctor again. He was kind but honest about the results. The treatments might buy me a few extra months, but they wouldn't change the outcome. I nodded quietly, taking in the words, though they barely registered anymore. He asked if I had family support. I said yes, though in truth I hadn't told anyone yet. I left the clinic that day feeling strangely calm. The world outside looked sharper than usual, as if every color had deepened slightly. Maybe that's what happens when you realize how little time you have left. Everything ordinary begins to glow with a quiet urgency. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the man my wife had chosen. I imagined him sitting across from her, laughing in the same way I used to. The thought made me nauseous. I pulled out my laptop again and went back to his social media page. His wife had posted a new picture just that morning. She was smiling, holding her pregnant belly in front of a mirror. The caption read something about counting down the weeks until they became parents. I stared at the screen for a long time, my chest tightening with a mix of pity and dread. It was almost unbearable to think that she had no idea what kind of man she was married to. I knew what it felt like to trust someone completely and then have that trust shattered. I didn't want her to go through the same without warning. I kept imagining her holding that baby, thinking her husband was faithful and devoted when in reality he was sneaking around with my wife. The thought gnawed at me until it became impossible to ignore. The next day I sat at my desk drafting a message to her. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to type. How do you tell a stranger that their life is about to fall apart? How do you balance truth against kindness when both will hurt? I deleted and retyped the message several times, each version sounding either too cold or too emotional. Eventually I closed the laptop again, unable to make a decision. That night I lay awake listening to the wind rattling against the window. I kept imagining all the different ways she might react if I told her. Maybe she'd thank me. Maybe she'd hate me for it. Maybe she'd block me and pretend I never existed. I realized then that I wasn't just worried about her reaction. I was afraid of what it would make me confront. Telling her would mean reliving the betrayal again in full detail, opening the wound I had just begun to numb. The following morning, as I watched the sunrise through the kitchen window, I realized that my hesitation wasn't about morality or fear of confrontation. It was about energy. Dying takes effort. It requires conserving what little strength you have left for things that still matter. And yet there was something in me that refused to let this other woman live in a lie any longer. She deserved to know. So I made myself a promise. I would give it one more day to think things through, and if by tomorrow I still felt the same, I would tell her everything. I would send that message no matter the fallout. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about leaving at least one corner of this tangled mess a little more honest before my time ran out. When I went to bed that night, I felt a strange steadiness settle over me. The decision wasn't made yet, but I knew it was coming. Somewhere deep inside, I could already feel the words forming, waiting for daylight. The next morning arrived cold and gray, with a mist that made the street outside look like it was holding its breath. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching cars drift through the fog. It struck me how ordinary the world looked despite everything that had happened. Somewhere people were making breakfast, packing lunches, arguing over parking spots. Somewhere life was still moving forward without pause. Yet here I was frozen in place with a truth too heavy to carry and too dangerous to keep. I had barely slept. Most of the night had been spent imagining what might happen if I told her the truth about her husband. I pictured her reaction in endless variations. Shock, anger, disbelief, sadness. And every time I tried to imagine her voice, it sounded too kind for what she would have to hear. I didn't even know her name yet, just her face from photographs and the faint glow of her happiness that radiated through every picture. She looked like the type of person who saw good in everyone, the kind who would bring extra snacks to work or remember birthdays. The thought of crushing that kind of goodness made my chest ache, but keeping quiet felt worse. After breakfast, I opened my laptop again. I pulled up her profile and read through a few posts. Her most recent one was a photo of a baby shower gift. A tiny blanket embroidered with the word, hope. I stared at it for a long time. The symbolism was too painful to ignore. Hope was what I had run out of and what she was unknowingly building her life upon. Felt cruel not to tell her. So I started to type. My first line was simple. I'm sorry to contact you like this, but there's something you deserve to know. I hesitated after writing those words, my finger hovering above the delete key. There was no going back once I sent it. I could already imagine the chaos that would follow. The man would find out she knew, and my ex-wife would eventually trace it back to me. But what was left for them to ruin? My life had already been stripped bare. I had nothing left to lose. So I kept writing. I told her about the affair as plainly as I could without bitterness or embellishment. I included dates, details, and even the business trip where it started. I told her how I had found out and how I was certain of everything. I avoided judgment. I didn't tell her what to do or how to feel. I simply gave her the truth. When I finished, I read the message twice to make sure it wasn't cruel, just honest. Then I hit send. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. My heart pounded as I watched the little check mark appear beside the message. I half expected an instant reply, maybe disbelief or anger, but none came. Minutes turned into an hour and still nothing. I closed the laptop and sat back, feeling both relieved and sick at once. There was no satisfaction in what I had done, only a hollow stillness like the air after thunder. That evening I went for a walk through the neighborhood. The cold air bit at my face, and for the first time in weeks I felt present inside my body again. There was something freeing about having told the truth, even if it would bring chaos later. Secrets have a way of poisoning everything around them, and I had finally cut one loose. When I returned home, the house looked smaller somehow, but cleaner too. I made tea, sat on the couch, and waited for whatever would come next. It didn't take long. A few hours later, my phone buzzed. Her name appeared on the screen, followed by a short message. "I don't know who you are, but I think I need to hear what you have to say." My hands trembled as I read it. I replied, simply confirming who I was and how I came to know. We exchanged a few more messages, each one slower than the last, as she absorbed the details. She thanked me for being honest, but said she needed time to process. I told her I understood completely. Then she went silent again. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next day my ex-wife called. Her voice was sharp and panicked. Somehow her lover must have told her what had happened, because she started shouting before I could even speak. She accused me of destroying lives, of meddling where I had no right. I let her rant until she ran out of words. Then I told her calmly that truth only destroys lies, not people. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to hear her breathing, then she hung up without another word. For the first time since the diagnosis, I felt something close to peace. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was close to relief. The weight I'd been carrying for weeks felt lighter now that everything was out in the open. I spent the rest of the day sitting in the sun that drifted through the living room window, watching dust motes spin lazily in the light. It struck me how beautiful small things could be once you stop taking them for granted. That evening I received one more message from the woman. She said she had confronted her husband and that he had admitted everything. She said it was devastating, but she was grateful to know the truth before the baby arrived. She ended her message with a line that stayed with me long after I put my phone down. "Sometimes the worst truth still gives you freedom." Those words echoed in my mind as I lay in bed later that night. Freedom. It was something I hadn't felt in years. Even before the betrayal, there had been a quiet suffocation in my marriage, an unspoken tension that neither of us dared name. Now, with everything stripped away, I realized I was finally free. Free from deceit, from pretense, from the heavy illusion of permanence. I would die soon, but at least I would die honest. As I drifted toward sleep, I imagined the woman holding her newborn someday, perhaps telling the child that truth matters even when it hurts. And in that strange thought, I found a kind of comfort I hadn't known I needed. Life had taken nearly everything from me, but it hadn't taken my ability to do one small good thing before the end. When the night deepened and the wind whispered against the windows, I felt something inside me settle. I had told the truth, and in doing so I had closed a circle that never should have existed in the first place. In the days that followed, I found myself waking up earlier than usual, as if my body no longer needed the illusion of rest. The mornings were slow, quiet, and filled with that faint chill that lingers just before sunrise. I would sit on the porch wrapped in a blanket with a cup of coffee I barely tasted and listen to the world come alive around me. Birds still sang, cars still rumbled down the street, and somewhere far off a neighbor's dog barked, as though the universe had no idea I was running out of time. There was something strangely comforting about that indifference. Life moved on whether I was ready or not. After sending that message to the other woman and hearing back from her, my days began to take on a different kind of rhythm. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was steadier. I felt lighter in the way a man feels after unburdening himself from a secret too heavy to carry alone. I had expected regret or guilt to creep in, but instead there was only quiet relief. I told the truth and let the pieces fall where they may. I had spent too many weeks choking on silence, and now that it was gone, the air felt clearer. My ex-wife hadn't called again, though she sent a few texts over the next week. Each one was a tangled mix of self-pity and anger. She said her affair partner's wife had kicked him out and blamed me for it. She wrote about how everyone at work was whispering about her and how I had ruined her life. I didn't respond. Every word she sent felt like an echo from a past I no longer belonged to. I deleted her messages unread after that. For the first time in years, I realized I didn't owe her my attention anymore. As my health began to decline, I noticed that the smallest tasks required more effort. Carrying laundry up the stairs left me winded and dizzy. Some nights I would wake up coughing so hard I thought I might pass out. Yet even in those moments there was a strange clarity. The fear that once consumed me had dulled into acceptance. It wasn't courage, really just exhaustion from fighting what couldn't be changed. One afternoon, I finally gathered the strength to visit my parents. I hadn't told them about my diagnosis yet. I kept postponing it, waiting for the right moment, though I knew such a moment would never come. My mother greeted me with her usual warmth, her eyes lighting up the way they always had when I came home. She fussed over me, offering food and asking about work. My father sat in his usual chair by the window reading the newspaper, though I noticed the subtle worry behind his calm expression. I wanted to tell them everything right then, but the words caught in my throat. So I stayed for dinner and let the evening pass like any other ordinary night. Driving back home afterward, the sky had turned deep blue and the road shimmered faintly with the reflection of streetlights. I kept thinking about how easy it is to delay the things that matter most until you run out of chances. The truth about my illness was another truth waiting to be set free, but I needed a little more time before facing it. I wasn't ready to watch the light leave my parents' faces just yet. A few days later, the woman I had written to messaged me again. She told me she had filed for divorce. Her tone was calm but resolute. She thanked me once more for telling her the truth and said that even though it hurt, she felt liberated. She had learned that peace doesn't always arrive softly, sometimes it comes with fire. Reading her words filled me with a quiet sense of closure. The chaos had unfolded exactly as I expected, yet somehow everything felt cleaner now, as if some small balance in the universe had been restored. That night, as I sat by the window watching the lights of passing cars, I began thinking about what forgiveness really meant. Not the kind people talk about in cliches, but the quiet kind that creeps up when anger runs out. I didn't forgive my ex-wife for what she did, but I also didn't hate her anymore. Hate takes energy, and I no longer had much to spare. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. What remained between us now was only distance and silence, and that was enough. My body grew weaker with each passing week, yet my mind seemed sharper. I started noticing small things I had long ignored. The way dust glimmered in sunlight, the faint hum of the refrigerator at night, the soft weight of blankets that still smelled faintly of detergent. Every detail felt magnified, as if the world were giving me one last chance to appreciate it before I left. One evening I found myself sorting through old photos. There were pictures of my wife and me smiling on vacations, birthdays, dinners with friends. Looking at them, I realized that for all the lies that came later, there had still been moments of genuine happiness. They were real once, even if everything else crumbled afterward. That realization didn't bring pain the way I thought it would. Instead, it felt like a quiet acceptance that life is made of temporary truths. When I finally turned off the light that night, I felt the first hint of real peace settle in my chest. The storm had passed. The lies were gone. The anger had burned out. I knew what I had to do next. Tomorrow I would go back to my parents' house and tell them everything. The diagnosis, the prognosis, and the time I had left. I owed them that honesty before it was too late. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of my breathing, counting each exhale like it was a gift. For the first time in months, I didn't feel lost. I had done what I could to make things right, and now all that was left was truth, the only thing that still felt solid beneath my feet. The drive to my parents' house the next morning felt longer than usual, even though it was the same familiar route I had taken hundreds of times before. Every tree, every stretch of pavement looked sharper under the pale light of dawn, as if the world itself had become more vivid now that I was preparing to say something irreversible. I kept rehearsing the words in my head, though none of them felt right. How do you tell the people who gave you life that you are running out of it? I imagined my mother's expression, her hands flying to her mouth, her tears falling before I could even finish speaking. I imagined my father sitting perfectly still, absorbing every word in silence, the way he always did when he didn't know how to help. When I finally pulled into their driveway, my chest felt tight, not from illness, but from the weight of what I was about to do. The smell of coffee drifted from the open window, and I could hear my mother humming softly somewhere inside. For a brief second, I considered turning the car around and driving back home, but the thought passed quickly. There was no more running from this. I owed them the truth. My mother greeted me with her usual warmth, wrapping me in a hug that lingered longer than usual. Maybe she already sensed something. We sat in the kitchen where sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting the table in soft gold. She poured coffee while asking if I'd been eating well and how work was going. I waited for her to sit before I spoke. My voice shook as I told them about the diagnosis, about the tests, about the prognosis that left no room for hope. My mother's face went pale, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for mine. My father didn't say a word for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but low, asking practical questions about treatments and second opinions. It was the same tone he used when fixing things that were broken around the house. Only this time there was nothing to fix. I expected tears, but what I got instead was silence so thick it filled the room like fog. Then my mother stood up and started pacing the kitchen, muttering that there must be some mistake, that doctors can be wrong. I let her talk because I understood. Denial was her first language when it came to pain. My father looked at me across the table, his eyes red but dry. He nodded slowly as if to acknowledge that he had heard me, that he believed me, that he was already preparing himself to stay strong for both of them. After a while, my mother sat back down and took my hands again. She didn't speak. She just stared at me like she was trying to memorize every detail of my face. In that moment, I realized that no amount of time would ever make this easier. I stayed the entire afternoon while they processed the news. My father called my sister so I wouldn't have to repeat the story myself. She arrived within an hour and immediately burst into tears when she saw me. We sat together on the porch for a long while, not talking much, just letting the wind fill the silence between us. That evening before leaving, my parents asked if I wanted to move back in with them so they could take care of me. I told them I needed some time to think about it, though I already knew the answer. I wanted to keep my own space for as long as I could still manage it. I didn't want them to see me fading day by day. I wanted their last memories of me to still resemble the son they knew, not the ghost I was becoming. Driving home that night, the sunset looked almost unreal, a blaze of orange spilling across the horizon. I pulled over at a small overlook and sat watching until the sky turned violet. I thought about all the sunsets I had missed over the years, rushing from one obligation to the next, convinced there would always be another chance. I sat there until the last light disappeared behind the hills and whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. The next few weeks became a strange blend of calm and chaos. My family called often, checking in with gentle voices that tried too hard to sound normal. My mother started sending meals even though she knew I barely ate. My sister texted daily with little reminders to rest or go outside. I appreciated it, but it also reminded me of what was coming. Every kind gesture felt like a soft goodbye in disguise. My health continued to slip quietly downward. The coughing fits grew harsher, the fatigue deeper. On the good days, I managed to walk around the neighborhood. On the bad days, I stayed in bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the hum of life beyond my walls. Through it all, I found myself thinking about the woman I had told the truth to. I wondered how she was doing, whether her baby had arrived, whether she had found peace in her new solitude. I didn't message her again, though the urge lingered. She had her own life to rebuild, and I didn't want my shadow hanging over it. One night, as I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, I realized that everything had come full circle. The truth had broken open every lie that once trapped me. My marriage was gone, but so was the constant ache of pretending. My secrets were no longer buried inside me. Even my illness no longer felt like a curse. It was simply the last chapter in a story that had already given me more clarity than I ever expected to find. When I finally stood to go to bed, my reflection caught in the darkened window. I barely recognized the man staring back. Thinner, yes, older somehow, but calmer too. His eyes no longer held anger, only a kind of quiet acceptance. For the first time in a long time, I didn't look away. I knew what I wanted to do next. Before I left this world, I would write letters to everyone who mattered. To my parents, to my sister, and yes, even to my ex-wife. Not for forgiveness, but for closure. Words would be all I had left to leave behind, and I wanted them to mean something. I turned off the lights and felt the house settle around me. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees like a whisper of something larger than grief, something softer than regret. I knew sleep would not come easily that night, but for once that didn't bother me. Some things no longer needed fixing. The first letter I wrote was to my parents. I started it in the middle of the night when the air was so still that I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock from the next room. I didn't plan the words in advance. They came naturally, like water finding its own course through the rocks. I told them that their love had been the truest constant in my life, that their kindness had shaped every good part of me. I thanked them for giving me the strength to face everything that had come my way and for teaching me to live with quiet decency. I asked them not to spend their remaining years drowning in grief but instead to look for me in small things, in a morning breeze or the first light on their kitchen window. When I finished writing, I folded the pages neatly and felt a calm I hadn't known in months. The next letter was to my sister. I reminded her of the summer we built a fort out of old bedsheets and cardboard boxes in the backyard, and how that little world of our own had felt endless. I told her that life will never wait for the right time to be lived, that it should be grabbed with both hands even when it's messy. I asked her to visit our parents often and to laugh with them because laughter would be the only thing that made the silence bearable. Writing the letter to my ex-wife took longer. I started and stopped several times, unsure of what tone to take. Anger felt pointless, yet forgiveness still felt out of reach. In the end, I settled on honesty. I told her that what she did broke something in me that will never fully mend, but I also told her that I no longer wished her harm. I wrote that her choices had forced me to see how fragile trust is and how vital truth can be. I told her she should raise her child to value kindness above everything else because life has a way of humbling even the proudest hearts. I didn't know whether she would read the letter or tear it apart, but that didn't matter. The act of writing it was enough. Once the letters were done, I placed them in a small wooden box along with my will and a note addressed to my doctor giving permission to share my medical records with my family. It felt strange to be preparing my own ending, like arranging furniture before leaving a house for good. Yet there was comfort in the order of it. Dying didn't scare me anymore, not really. What frightened me once was leaving without being understood. But now everything that needed saying had been said. In the weeks that followed, my strength began to slip away more noticeably. Walking across the room became a slow, deliberate act. The doctors had been right. The end would not be quick, but it would be certain. My parents visited often, sometimes sitting quietly by my side while I dozed. My mother had stopped crying in front of me, though I could see the traces of it in her swollen eyes. My father stayed mostly silent, but every now and then he would rest his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that said more than words ever could. My sister brought small comforts: homemade soup, fresh sheets, a new book I never found the energy to read. I spent most afternoons near the window watching the light shift through the trees. The seasons were changing and the air carried that faint crispness that comes before autumn. Time had become less about days and more about moments. Small flashes of clarity that felt almost sacred. I thought about the woman I had once written to and how she might be holding her baby now. I hoped she had found her own version of peace and that her child would grow up surrounded by honesty. I would never know how her story ended, but in a way it didn't matter. My part in it was already complete. One evening my father brought an old record player from their attic. We set it up in the corner of the living room and listened to the soft crackle as the needle met the vinyl. A slow tune filled the room, one my mother used to hum when I was little. The sound wrapped around me like a blanket. For a few minutes there was no pain, no fear, only the warmth of being surrounded by the people who had loved me from the very beginning. I realized then that endings don't always come with grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes they arrive quietly in the form of a familiar song played one last time. That night as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had happened over the past months. The diagnosis, the betrayal, the anger, the truth, and the stillness that followed. None of it had unfolded the way I expected, but maybe that was the point. Life rarely obeys our plans. It twists and bends and sometimes breaks, but it always moves forward. I had spent so long mourning what I lost that I almost missed the small grace of what remained. My breathing had become shallow but steady. I focused on the rhythm, letting it guide me into a calm that felt deeper than sleep. I thought about the word freedom again, the one the other woman had written to me. It had sounded distant then, but now I understood it. Freedom wasn't about escape or revenge or even forgiveness. It was about acceptance. It was the space that opens up inside you when you stop fighting what cannot be changed. Before I closed my eyes, I whispered a quiet thank you to the world for everything it had given and taken away. I didn't know if anyone or anything was listening, but it didn't matter. The gratitude itself was enough. In the stillness of that night, I felt the boundaries of my pain loosen just a little. The anger had burned out, the grief had softened, and what remained was something simple and pure. A kind of peace that no one could take from me. The truth had finally done its work. It had broken me open and left me free.